This is our fourth and final video dealing with the module of immigration. So let's begin with our learning objective. There is only one for this final video. What I would like all of you to be able to understand is what is meant by the term melting pot metro. Unfortunately, that term seems at first glance like you'd already know what it means. It means a city or a metropolitan area defined by a high degree of diversity. And while that is true, there's actually a somewhat more specific definition that we're going to talk about as we go through the next few slides. So let's begin by looking at this right here. This actually comes from the 2000 census. We could find the exact same data for the 2010 census, which was released about a year ago. But trust me, not that much has changed because the immigration phenomena has been pretty much consistent and constant over the course of the last 20 years. And what we have here are the largest cities in the United States, just the central cities, not the entire metropolitan area. So the largest, of course, is New York, followed by Los Angeles, and then Chicago, and so on through the list. The total population is listed here. That's not that important, but what I want you to look at here is the absolute number of people who were born outside of the United States. But even more importantly, it's this number I want you to look at. So for the city of New York, about 36%, so that's more than 1 out of every 3 people who lived in New York City in the year 2000 was born outside of the United States. That's a really high percentage. And what this indicates to me, or maybe a better way of putting it, is what this proves to me is how decidedly metropolitan and urban the new immigrants have been in terms of their settlement patterns. That's one of the reasons why in New York today there are roughly 100 languages that are spoken in the public schools. So imagine how that kind of challenges the public schools in New York, because you need a lot of different people who can teach in a variety of languages bilingually. The same thing would be true in Los Angeles. Look at that number for Los Angeles. It's even higher, 41%. So getting close to almost half of the total population was born outside of the United States. And together, what this number kind of suggests to me, or what these numbers suggest to me, is that we're basically living through a moment that is a lot like what the United States was experiencing about 100 or 120 years ago, when we were at the peak of the European immigration. And the same thing was true for cities like New York, kind of the era of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island and so forth. Look at Chicago, because Chicago is the big city of the Midwest. And it's a little less, kind of expectedly. You know, we're in the Midwestern part of the country, a little farther from the coasts. But it's still more than 20%, which means more than 1 out of every 5 people who currently lives in Chicago was born outside of the United States and is currently, of course, living in the United States. And then finally, way down at the bottom of the list is a special candidate or a special case, Miami, which has well over half of its population having been born outside of the United States. So the most extreme example of this very diverse, very immigrant-focused urban pattern that we have in the United States is in Miami. Now the reason I show these to you is because what this means then is that you could live in the United States in, let's say, I don't know, northern rural Wisconsin, and none of these changes would be that visible. They tend to be really concentrated in just those big cities. So it's in those big cities where these really epic shifts in American culture are likely given their most forceful expression. So I'm going to explain how that's the case by introducing this concept of the melting pot metro. Now, what this means is we have a metropolitan area, not just a central city, but the entire metropolitan area, which includes all of the suburbs as well, where there no longer is any one racial or ethnic group that goes above 50%, that has a majority of the population. You know, through most of American history, there would have been a so-called, quote-unquote, white majority in just about every major American metropolitan area, but that's no longer true, there's a lot more diversity today as a result of these new immigration flows. So here is just one example of what demographers call a melting pot metro. It's Miami and Fort Lauderdale, basically South Florida. South Florida, that big city at the tip of Florida, has just under 6 million people. And here's the breakdown. So the Hispanic population is about 40%. Notice it's not a majority, but it is the largest of the four groups. What that means is Miami-Fort Lauderdale has a Hispanic plurality. If you've not heard that term before, it means you don't have a majority, but you're the largest constituency. The white population, just under that, with about 36%. African Americans at about 1/5. And the Asian component kind of tiny, but that makes sense because Miami is really the kind of capital of Latin American immigration and Caribbean immigration to the United States. So there's really relatively few Asians that have settled in the Miami-Fort Lauderdale metropolitan area. So when did this happen? It happened sometime between 1990 and the year 2000. Before that, Miami-Fort Lauderdale would have had a so-called white majority. And today, because of immigration, it's much more diverse. I should point out one thing before we move on, and that is the Hispanic category is a hugely and incredibly diverse category. So to paint with such a broad brush is kind of making a mistake. There are, for example, Cuban Americans, there are Brazilian Americans, and a variety of other groups that would generically kind of fall into that category. And so to suggest that you have kind of a block that's just called Hispanic is kind of ignoring how much diversity there is. And that's true with regard to all of these groups here. But we need to use the official census designations. Now here's another example of a melting pot metro. Los Angeles, which is huge, 16 million people, which means it's about, almost 3 times as populous as the entire state of Wisconsin. Here again, we no longer have a situation where any one group, quote unquote, has a majority of the population. There's a Hispanic plurality, the white population just below that. Here we have Asians as a much more significant component of the population, and I'm hoping that makes sense because of geographic proximity, chain migration, and so forth. The Asian component in Los Angeles is much higher. African American component a little smaller, and that makes sense as well. The west coast of the U.S. was kind of historically the least African American part of the United States, of course in contrast to the South and the Midwest, which typically have a much higher share of the population that identifies as African American. Finally, let's just look at Chicago. Chicago is really the big city of the Midwest, not too far from where we sit. Now, I could ask a question if this were a face-to-face class. Is Chicago technically a melting pot metro? The answer would be no. It's still very diverse, with 9 million people in the metropolitan area. That includes everything from Chicago to Gary up to Kenosha. The white population does still have a majority. And so because you have that majority above 50%, then it's really not technically satisfying our definition of a melting pot metro. But it may become one by the year 2020 if current immigration trends basically are constant and remain the same. Here we have the African American population much higher, and that makes sense. Chicago historically over the 20th century was a really important magnet for African Americans leaving the South and looking for all sorts of opportunities, both economic and cultural, in the North. The Hispanic population, a little smaller compared to LA and Miami. Again, that maybe makes sense. And the Asian component smaller as well. So, technically, Chicago is not a melting pot metro, but it may become one relatively soon. And then finally, another way of talking about a melting pot metro is basically if you no longer have one group that's a majority. Typically what this then means is that no one group has that status, so you typically have in most of these melting pot metros this other condition as well. You have what might be called a minority white population. Although I don't like using the terms minority majority, they're kind of old school terms that I think have lost a little bit of their resonance. But nevertheless, if we look carefully at this particular map, what do we see? There are a lot of metropolitan areas in the United States that over the course of the last roughly 20 years have become places that are, again, melting pot metros. And the reason is because of immigration primarily. So Miami, where only 35% of the population, and that's the entire metropolitan area, in the year 2010 identified as white, is one good example. Notice that the color code green means that for Miami there is a Hispanic plurality. New York is also a melting pot metro, and just about every big city in California and the so-called borderlands with Mexico are as well, largely because, but not exclusively because, of immigration from Latin America, Mexico in particular. Now I'll just add one more thing before I close this video. The number of metropolitan areas in the United States that are technically melting pot metros is of course increasing. In the year 1990 there were 9, in the year 2000 there were 14, and in the year 2010 there were 22. So that number is increasing, and what that means is that of course the entire United States is becoming much more diverse. And it's in these big cities where that diversity is most forcefully expressed and was expressed in the initial stages of this transformation. So kind of the future, if you will, could be found in these big cities. That concludes our discussion of immigration. Our next topic is going to be, in a way, a radical departure. We're going to be talking about language. And what we'll be doing is moving on to chapter 5 in the textbook.